please see your chairs back. We asked you to get out of this room by not making the chairs back where they were. Very good.
Like in a band or something?
Before we get started, what I'll do is I'd like to make an acknowledgement to the people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional owners of the land that we stand on. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're standing on stolen lands. These lands have never been ceded. And this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to acknowledge that we are about to start talking a little bit about Islamophobia and racism, and any discussion centred around racism and Islamophobia in this country must be centred around 2 centuries of racism, genocide and discrimination that our First Nations brothers and sisters have endured and continue to endure. So it has to be within that context, because otherwise we kind of lose our focus. So a little bit about myself. My name's Apsara Sabaratnam, and I'm a committee member with Jasmine Ali in Stand Together Against Racism, and I'm going to be your MC for the night. And tonight we've got a few speakers here, which is from across sections of organisation. I'm going to introduce all of them as we speak. So we've got furthest left is Hilikari, who is heads up Trades Hall in Victoria.
Why furthest left?
He's so left, he's about to fall off. You're so left, you're going to fall off the side of the cliff, Luke. Love it. And then we've got Senator Janet Rice just sitting next to him. And next to Senator Janet is Mohmad Helmy, who is from the Islamic Council of Victoria, and Jasmine Ali, who is a co-committee member with myself in Stand Together Against Racism. So I just want to give a little bit about, a little bit about a context about why we're here today and why this forum was actually planned. So, I mean, the obvious one is it's been planned because of in response to the terrorist act that took place that has resulted in 50 Muslim men, women and children dying needlessly. What we are really finding, and many of us in migrant communities and people of colour are finding that, and are quite acutely aware that racism and Islamophobia is on the rise, and it's largely due to the right. And also not just the right, but they also have enablers. Much of their enablers are in politics and in the right-wing media as well. So we have to constantly be calling out these organisations, because what they're doing is quite divisive, and it's quite a deliberate drive. We also have to recognise what's happening here, and this kind of divisive language and divisiveness that is actually being created is largely due to, because we are actually living in, right now is the most unequal time in modern history. We know that since World War II, this is the most unequal time in the global history. And so instead of these politicians having a vision for a different Australia, for a different global state, what we're finding is that these politicians and media moguls are focusing on the most vulnerable people in our societies. And the most vulnerable often are migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and over the last 20 years has been Muslim people as well, and we have to be very conscious about that too. Therefore, this forum has been planned with the express purpose of actually bringing together leaders of civil society organisations, the union movement and political parties. What we want to say in this forum is we want us to unite together. There are many of us who are having these fights, but it's all we're doing is putting out spot fires. What we would like to see from this forum and taking away from this forum is for us to maybe put some of our differences aside, but to actually work collaboratively to stamp out racism and Islamophobia. Because when we, as the union movement, and I'm a proud union member myself, we know when we do things together, we are so much stronger than when we are doing things on our own. So what I hope, and we all hope to get out of today, is that this can be the beginning of something big and something that we can all take away from here and work together, So I think that's a great opportunity. So what I'll do now is I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and our first speaker is Anu Kaloti. Anu is coming live to us, so that's why she's up there.
Yes, I told Anu 7. So
Oh, sure. Okay. All right, no worries.
give a bell to Warner.
So who, Janet? Or Mohammed?
Just like him ring her and ask.
No, that's okay. Yep. So, Mohammed? Yeah, okay. So I'll introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mohamad Helmy. Mohamad is the Secretary of the Islamic Council of Victoria and a long-standing Muslim community and anti-racism activist. Please put your hands for Mohamad Helmy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peace be upon you all. I thank the organisers of tonight and also for all of you for attending. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and I pay respects to their elders past, present and future. Always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. I guess because I, out of the speakers, represent to some extent the Muslim community, more specifically really the Islamic Council of Victoria, I'll start off by giving a little bit of a perception of how the Muslim community and how the Islamic Council of Victoria specifically sees Islamophobia. So I'd like to start by making the argument at the outset that there is a direct link between political hate speech and hate crimes in our community. We can see that. We can see the numbers. And we have a question to ask ourselves. Do we need legislative changes to protect the community, and particularly the voiceless in our community, against hate speech and therefore hate crimes? In March 2017, and I'll mention the name, Pauline Hanson said, Islam is a disease that Australia should be vaccinated against. More recently, Fraser Anning said in response to the shocking terror attack in Christchurch, he said, and I quote, "Does anyone still dispute the link between Muslim immigration and violence?" End of quotation. Blaming the attack on the Muslim community, blaming the victim for being present. His statement was written on an Australian parliamentary letterhead using tax resources, tax money, my tax money and your tax money. These people have no place in our parliament. This kind of rhetoric is not confined to Pauline Hanson and Fraser Anning. It is far more common. The Morrison government also has some responsibility to be accounted for. While slightly more subtle, the Morrison government employs fear, Islamophobia, and anti-refugee sentiments for political gains. When he was a shadow cabinet minister in December 2019, Morrison urged his colleagues to capitalize on the electorate's growing concerns about Muslim immigration and Muslim immigration, and also the inability of the Muslim community to integrate within the wider community. In 2012, Morrison also issued a press statement linking refugee numbers to increase of disease in Australia. After 2018 Burke Street attack, which you might remember, the Prime Minister laid the blame entirely on the entire Muslim community and held its leaders accountable. He said he identified the vile presence of radical Islam as a cause of the attack, dismissing the mental state of the attacker as a lame excuse. I quote. He also added that the leaders of the community need to know what's going on in their community and there can be no excuses for looking the other way. Of course, he said nothing of that after the recent Christchurch attack. The employment of Islamophobia for political gains is a concerning trend. It can normalize what's not acceptable, and when it comes from political leaders, it sets the culture, the national culture and agenda and the norms in our country. As Senator Pat Dotson said in his parliamentary speech, which is an amazing speech, he said to to the meaning of that the murder of 50 innocent people did not just happen. It arises from the fueling of hatred and irresponsible language by political and media leaders and the demonizing of people of color and difference. There is a direct link between political rhetoric and increase in violent attacks and racist attacks on the streets. This is true in Australia and elsewhere as well. Political media rhetoric results in emboldening racists to target the Muslim community. This targeting starts at daily acts of racism and vilification in public spaces, ranging from verbal abuse, spitting, pulling the hijab off for the women who wear the hijab. Muslim women are a particular target of this. It includes religion-based vilification in the workplace, and it reaches its epic at something like Christchurch. So while Christchurch is unprecedented in its impact and its size, it's not unprecedented in terms of its ideology. The Muslim community faces vilification and racism on regular, if not daily basis. Free speech is not hate speech. Leadership rhetoric influences public thinking, and leadership comes with responsibility. Free speech comes with a price, and those who pay the price are the weaker in the community, those who law is supposed to be made to protect. Some stats on Islamophobia. Islamophobia in Australia 2014 to 2016 report revealed that 1 in 10 Australians are highly Islamophobic. In a recent University of Sydney study, which was published in 2019 based on New South Wales police report, they said that a person's religion is more likely to make them a victim of hate crime than any other factor. Yet, the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 does not provide any protection based on religion. In the same report, it said that more than 2 out of every 3 hate crimes investigated between July 2013 and June 2016, this is New South Wales Police data, were related to religious belief, and Muslims were targeted in 73% of these cases. The second highest was the Jewish community at 14% of these cases. Post-Christchurch, the ICV has certainly, and I was speaking to Luke about that just before, the ICV has certainly seen a spike in attacks against the Muslim community, both against individuals and against mosques. Some of them were pretty unpalatable. Islamophobia is on the rise, and unless we do something about it, we might witness a Christchurch in one of our own cities. Morrison governments, I want to mention something about the CVE policy, or CVE programs that they've been running. For the Morrison government and the media, terrorism is a term normally only associated with the Muslim community, or generally non-whites. This has led to authorities being blindsided by their own prejudices of what terrorism is, and have missed what could be argued as one of the most serious threats to Australian national security, and that is the fast-growing far-right extremism. Let's not forget that the perpetrator of Christchurch was Australian and was not on the radar of any Australian authorities, despite his history. A pivotal part of the Liberal government's response to the issue of terrorism is predominantly and exclusively, actually, a security-based response. The Liberal government's counter-violent extremism CVE programs have only focused on the terrorism as defined by their prejudices, Muslim terrorism. This biased, one-sided view has led to social dysfunction through its interventions, racial profiling, and lack of community consultation. This all plays into the Islamophobic narrative. Countering Islamophobia. Firstly, it is important to acknowledge that Islamophobia in Australia is a societal problem. It is not an Islamic problem. Therefore, the responsibility of combating Islamophobia must be collective. This is because hate and racism against any sector of our community is an attack on the very fabric of our society. Racism takes turns, you see. It's now the Muslims, but it has been others before. Only 2 years ago, Pauline Hanson referred to said that we were overrun by Asians only 2 years ago. Secondly, it is important to recognize Islamophobia as a form of racism, that it is. It is just a special form of racism because it is not against a single race, but against a multiracial, diverse community. In terms of some specific actions, so at a national level, I think we need to change, we need a change of legislations to protect the Muslim community and other underrepresented communities and other minority groups against hate speech, particularly that coming from Parliament. The Racial Discrimination Act provides no protection against religious-based discrimination. And the RCV has been taking steps to support a parliamentary code of conduct for race ethics in the Parliament. In the workplace, as many workers and union members are Muslims, unions can do a lot to protect their fellow workers against workplace racism. And there is an opportunity for the union movement and the RCV to work together definitely on that front. At an individual level, and this is for everybody really in the room, speak out and call out racism where you see it. Don't keep quiet when you see somebody in a public place on a train or a train being harassed. Give that person, interestingly, often when I hear cases of public, particularly in trains, particularly in Melbourne, of racism, and in most cases it's against women, the thing that hurts most is the fact that the public keeps quiet. So I'm urging, I guess, my friends here to not keep quiet when you see something like that happen in public. Give that person who is being attacked, give them support. Speak to them, to him, her, and make them feel safer. A simple word of support, or even, "Are you okay?" can go a very long way to comfort that person who's under attack. Finally, and specifically to the Muslim community, and there is quite a few of them here tonight as well, including friends of mine, report what happens, report it to the police, report it to the Islamophobia register, and report it to the ICV. I know that the answer normally is, well, nothing gets done about it, but at least a case is built and memory is kept. So please do that, and thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting, and the insight that you provide, Mohmad, because often when we see racism, what we are seeing is really scratching the surface of what is actually happening within the community. And I think your point you said about as well, how you can actually work with the union movement is actually a pertinent one. We know that the fastest growing group of union members is actually migrants, new migrants. And so therefore, quite a large percentage of those people will be Muslim people as well. And I think it is definitely an area and great opportunity for both organisations to work together, definitely. So our next speaker here tonight is Jasmine Ali. My comrade Jasmine is one of the founding members of Stand Together Against Racism and a dedicated member of the collective. She's a long-term anti-racism activist, and she's written extensively. You can, if you go and search her online, you'll find heaps of articles that she's written about colonialism, racism, the far right, and multiculturalism. Thank you very much. Put your hands together for Jasmine.
Yeah, I'd just also like to acknowledge the country that we're on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty wasn't ceded. We're meeting on stolen land. And I'd like to, I think, highlight, I think, and situate, I think, the important challenge that we confront with Islamophobia, to really put that in the history of the brutal genocide that has occurred in this country, and the policies of colonialism they continue today. I mean, Randa Abdul Fattah, some people would have seen her on the drum recently talking about Islamophobia, and I think she highlighted this point very astutely, where she said, Australia was founded as a white settler colony based on genocide, theft, and the dispossession of Indigenous people, and that remains a central task of any transformative movement that seeks to uproot racism in this country. So I think that's an important insight that we have to carry in all our struggles against racism today. But the thing I want to do in terms of filling that out, I wanted to basically just cover four major points today. Hopefully I'm not going to overlap too much with what Mohmad has said. But firstly, I did want to go over just some of the detail about the man who committed the atrocity in Christchurch, and his links to Australia in terms of Australian politics more generally, because there has been a very strong argument that we've seen run by newspapers like The Australian to say that this was something, this radicalisation of this far-right neo-Nazi happened in Europe. It had nothing to do with Australia, and a very strong attempt to distance Australia from any culpability of what happened. And I think the links are very clear, and it's very obvious, those connections. So I want to go through that. I then wanted to just talk about how Islamophobia is actually public policy in Australia at the moment. It's not something fringe. I mean, Mohmad has gone over the very recurrent instances of Islamophobia, and it's very concerning actually to hear that Muslim women in particular are thinking about how do we actually, live with these attacks in our day-to-day life, instead of us asking the question, how do we stop them? They shouldn't be happening in the first place, to think about it and put it in those terms. And I think, thirdly, I just wanted to go over why it is, in terms of setting out the current public policy of Islamophobia and racism that we've seen over the last 6 years, and it stretches back, a very long time, before that. But why it is that governments are so fixated on Islamophobia in particular, as a particular form of racism today. And we see this here in Australia, and we see this around the world. So hopefully I'll be able to jam this all in as quickly as I can. So just to start with the man Brenton Tarrant. So as I said, there's been an attempt to distance him from Australia, and as the developments have come out time and time again, the links are so obvious, and they've been reported in the ABC. In his manifesto, he hails Blair Cottrell, the United Patriots Front in Australia. He hails Blair Cottrell as the emperor, right? This particular far-right group. And I can think back to 2016, Blair Cottrell was sitting in the ABC, doing panel discussions with people in mainstream media, promoting his ideas of hate and racism at that time. In 2016, Tarrant sent a death threat to a refugee supporter who was, they were talking about a refugee rally in Eltham at the time, and that was reported at the time, and that was another very clear link, about the way that this man had been, in a sense, imbued the political culture, the racist culture in Australian society that governments have created. And lastly, there's another thing in his manifesto. I think it is worth pointing out. It's a horrible thing to think about. Some of these details, but in one of the when he was in his writing, and I think even on his gun, he had cited Andreas Breivik. Andreas Breivik was another far-right thinker who committed mass atrocity over in Europe, and this has been another thing that the mainstream media have seized on to say this is something that he's when he was travelling there he adopted these ideas. But if you even look at Breivik's manifesto, he hails John Howard in that manifesto, somebody who, promoted Islamophobia to the hilt. Under John Howard's leadership, you had the Cronulla riots, right, where Lebanese and Muslim people were bashed on the beaches of Cronulla by an environment that John Howard created. So I think there's a very strong link that goes very deep into the heart of Liberal government policies for a very long time, and there's over a decade of this stuff. So I think that's important just to highlight. There are other various references, and I did want to point this out as well. In his manifesto, he talks about Australia, just like the rest of the colonies in Europe, is simply an offshoot of European, a finger of the hand of the body of Europe. These ideas, this particular idea about white Australia, when you think about it, that Australia was essentially a European offshoot, these were the founding ideas of this country, and they've been central to nationalism in this country, since, we've talked about for over 200 years. So I think that's very important to highlight as well. So as Mohmad has gone through a lot of the examples about the way that Islamophobia and hate speech in particular has surfaced over the last few years, but I just wanted to outline a few more of these examples. So the anti-terrorism legislation, even under Tony Abbott, we could see, the gross manipulation of the media, using the media to drum up Islamophobia during that time. There were raids on houses. Tony Abbott would call the media first you know, when these raids were happening. That was the first thing he did, because he wanted essentially to popularise this hatred and to popularise this fear. Draconian measures that we've seen, you know, have a really very material impact on the lives of Muslim people. You know, policies around preventative detention as part of the terror laws. Again, another way to encourage suspicion and fear. There's a report, I think a few days ago actually, about a young high school student in Canberra, Muslim student, who was reported to the authorities actually by a teacher for being, you know, a threat of radicalisation and terrorism, simply because the student had written a critical piece on foreign policy, you know, in this country. This is the level of scrutiny and suspicion and fear that people are living with, and it has, as I said, a very material impact. The other thing is about I think anti-refugee racism has been another way that, you know, the liberal Islamophobia and has been institutionalised as part of public policy. So you can see even very recently, you know, the legislative bills that have come through around offshore detention, and there have been, as part of that, a very strong argument about national security. You know, a smear of saying if refugees that you know, who are seeking to come here, they're all potentially terrorists. We need to be worried about that. We need to be afraid about that, and that's a very important way that the Liberal government every day, you know, has been pushing, you know, this refugee bashing with the onshore detention camps on Nauru and Manus, and you know, just the blatant, you know, things that we've seen that have bolstered this sort of white supremacy, you know, explicit ideology, you know, at the centre of politics. Peter Dutton fast-tracking white South African farmers for visas while, you know, languishing, you know, coloured people seeking, you know, refuge in Australia, simply because, you know, that's, you know, Peter Dutton's, you can see where his preferences lie about immigration policy. They're very reminiscent of the White Australia policy that we've seen in the past. And I think that another important component has been anti-immigration racism as well. This is, I think, a new challenge, I think, that confronts the left and, you know, and anti-racist struggles generally, because it's become very legitimate to talk about there being a cap on immigration, like this is some sort of sensible discussion either on climate policy, environmental policy and other avenues, and I think that's something we're going to have to grapple with, because, and, you know, in the very few days actually after the massacre happened, Scott Morrison came out and said he was for a hard cap on immigration, right? And if you look, you read Terence things, that's what he's talking about: Muslim immigration, immigrants coming in, invading white lands, etc. Like, you know, he's dog whistling to the same kind of politics. I think it's very explicit. And the other things that sort of Mohmad has touched on in terms of the debates about free speech, it's been another bulwark that the hard right in Australia has really, you know, I'm talking about in the Liberal Party here, you know, not the nationalists. The hard right have been pushing in terms of, you know, the motions around, you know, it's okay to be white motion in the Senate, which was, again, a white supremacist slogan, and, you know, other very explicit policies, it is a policy actually about erecting colonial monuments in Australia, you know, to Captain Cook. Again, they want to celebrate this ideology. They celebrate the foundations of this country, where we know, and people have been fighting to say they're rotten. They're, you know, they're based on racism. They're based on, you know, complete, you know, racist atrocities that have happened to Indigenous people. And these are the things that the government of today is celebrating as some great initiative. So I think that's an important thing, you know, an important piece of the general picture. And just finally, I think, just moving on about why is it, so we can see, like, the racist onslaught has been intensive, it's been ongoing, but why are they so committed? Why are they so committed to using racism in this way? And I think, you know, there's important things, I think, to go over with Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a particular kind of racism. You know, there's a lot of people who talk about Islamophobia and say it's not racist because, you know, I'm talking about a religion, you know, and Islam is not a race. And so therefore, you know, it falls outside the parameters of what's racism. And there's something I think we have to grapple with. There's at the centre of Islamophobia is the idea that there's something very exceptional about Islam. There's something, you know, particular about this particular religion that's different to every other religion. That means it requires more scrutiny, you know, more invasive attacks. People should be should live in fear about it in a way that they shouldn't about other kinds of, you know, other kinds of faith in wider society. And it's singled out in this way. And there's all sorts of, you know, racist inventions about trying to justify this. You know, throughout history, I don't necessarily need to go, we need to go over it at some point, but there's, a lot of things about, it's reactionary. There's something particular about women. There's something particular, about Islam and women. There's something particular about Islam and violence. All of these things, all of these manufactured ideas really have been, been the cornerstone of what's fueled Islamophobia. And I think we have to actually situate where that comes from. It's true that, governments are completely committed to dividing people, to scapegoating people. But we have to understand with Islamophobia in particular that these have its roots in imperial interventions and imperial policies. If you think about, after 9/11, the commitment of troops to Afghanistan, the commitment to intervention in Iraq, all of these policies where there was, bipartisan support when they started, these were justified, with Islamophobia as well. And even to this day, the failure of these Western interventions in these countries, mass slaughter, massacres in Iraq, half 500,000 people killed as a result. And even the failure of that whole, that whole situation in terms of setting up some kind of, liberated Iraqi government in that period, we saw, what they created was the conditions for something like ISIS to develop, and they have used Islamophobia again to justify this situation and to justify, instead of looking at the fact that it's actually, foreign policy at the root of it. It's simply something to do with Islam, in particular, where we've seen these, these kinds of developments. So I think that's another important thing that we have to look at, alongside the very explicit scapegoating that they use with immigration and refugee bashing. So just to finish, I think it's worth sort of situating how do we, in some ways, because of the very there's a fluidity to Islamophobia and the way that they can attach it to so many things. We have to be very explicit, I think, about linking up our struggles, and so I think it's, like Apsara has sort of noted, we are going to have to challenge the racism and fear and scapegoating that comes with the refugee bashing, to close the camps, to, really demand that, and to actually make that a reality in the next. Well, really, it should be happening right now. But this is a critical component, I think, of challenging the Islamophobia, linking these struggles up with the very important struggles that are happening at the moment. I mean, just last night we went to a vigil about incarceration, and the commemoration of the anniversary of the royal deaths in custody here, and Tanya Day is a woman, another death in custody here in Victoria. People were commemorating her loss, and that has to do with social policy in this country. We have to link up these struggles about incarceration, against refugee bashing, against the anti-migrant campaigns that are happening, and very importantly, with the union movement. Workers in this country have their own fights that they're going through as well, in terms of job security, in terms of wages, in terms of the right to strike. We have to be there with them, and we have to be linking up. I mean, anti-racist movements in this country have been the most powerful when they have been backed by the organised working class and by the trade union movement. And that's something that's going to be incredibly important between now and the election, and after we get a shortened government as well. So I'll just leave it there.
So I think, in a bit of a recap of that, we can actually see this Maltesian view creeping into a lot of things. It's obviously it's affecting nationalism, from a nationalist perspective, but it is definitely affecting the environmental movement as well, because there are a lot of people in the environmental movement that talk about population caps. And the other one is definitely the labour movement. We see that also in the labour movement, where there's this kind of rhetoric about visa workers coming here on working visas and what have you. And so these kind of things we need to be very conscious, I think, in any of our language, in the way in which we actually talk about these issues. Because often what that actually, if you start to join the dots, it is effectively creating a nationalistic fervour that is quite dangerous, I think. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Senator Janet Rice. Janet has a long and distinguished career in politics. She started off as a councillor in Maribyrnong, is that correct, Janet? And then became the Lord Mayor of Maribyrnong. and is now in federal parliament. She's not only been a politician, she's been a long-standing grassroots activist, and she's been an amazing activist both on the environmental front and also in achieving LGBTIQ equality for all. Thank you.
I also want to acknowledge that we're here today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay our respects to them, their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge, as others have said, that this is stolen land. And I was struck at the connection between what we're talking about tonight and the fact that this is stolen land, and this is, our country is based on that, on the massacres, on the genocide, on the stealing of land, at the event that I was just at before coming here tonight, which was a celebration of the Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. And it was the unveiling of a mural at the Preston Library of Yami Lester, who was an Indigenous anti-nuclear campaigner fighting for his people because of the impact on them by the nuclear weapons testing at Maralinga between 1956 and 1963. And I was just thinking about just the, right through Australian history, how much it has been based on pure, unadulterated racism of white people, the white British settlers coming in and saying, we are the superior ones. We are the people that are better than everybody else. The whole concept of terra nullius didn't acknowledge that Indigenous people even existed as humans, essentially. And then right through, and if you think about the fact that it was fine for the British, the Australian government welcomed the British in to conduct those nuclear tests at Maralinga, but again on the basis that, there's nobody there, there's nothing there that's worth protecting. It was just absolutely, pure racism, and that's what Australian society has been based on, and that's what we're having to grapple with now. And certainly as a Green, I know that it's only when we actually acknowledge that history, acknowledge what's gone on, and acknowledge that we have got so far to go before we've got justice for our First Nations people, that we're going to be able to move forward. And that moving forward is saying, yes, sovereignty was never ceded, and that we need to have treaties with our First Nations people, and then we can move on together, but we're so far from that at the moment. And tonight, talking about Islamophobia and racism, really I think is a terrific, bringing us together to, in one way of working out how we can move forward. I also want to pay my respects to the people, the victims and the people who were so deeply affected by what happened in Christchurch, and the repercussions and the reverberations that have spread out around the world, but particularly the friends, the families of the victims, the people, the survivors, and the Muslim community in New Zealand and the Muslim community here in Australia. Because Australia and New Zealand are so close, and the fact that it was an Australian who carried out this attack. And really send my sympathy and empathy and support to the Muslim community here in Australia. And obviously, as we know, and as Mohmad and Jasmine have said, Christchurch was the manifestation of Islamophobia and it's racism, and it's been allowed to fester. And certainly in the time that I've been in public life, I have seen it change. And you were reflecting on John Howard before. John Howard became Prime Minister in 1996. And and then the Tampa, sending back the Tampa in 2001, and just rising to the surface this xenophobia that previously had been, our politicians didn't go there before then until we had Howard coming into government, and then it was acceptable, and that racism was acceptable, and that's continued. And thinking about the fact that we have had, Liberal National Coalition governments, other than the sort of 6 years between 2007 and 2013, we've basically had those governments, racist governments in place in Australia for the last 23 years. So, and that I was, how old was I? 36, stood for federal election for the first time in 1996, that year that Howard got elected. And so during that time of sort of my political career, and certainly the time of the Greens, seeing what we've been battling against. And it really, I think we need to recognise the huge challenges that we face, but how important it is for this to be an issue that really comes to the fore and is something that we all work together on to tackle. And of course, we've got politicians in our parliament. We've got, the people in our federal and state parliaments. We've just had, Fraser Anning. I absolutely hope we're not going to see anything more of him, but Pauline Hanson is there. They're going to be more One Nation senators elected at this election. We've just had 2 One Nation MPs elected to the New South Wales Parliament. Bob Katter, Mark Latham, and then in the halls of our government, our Liberal Party, that somebody like Peter Dutton is able to be there and was potentially going to be our Prime Minister, and that Scott Morrison was, he was the more preferable option to Peter Dutton. I mean, we've got those people there and they have got that platform, and we really have got to work so hard to just rise up against them. I mean, Pauline Hanson, as people have already said tonight, this party leader who uses her speeches in the Parliament to openly and flagrantly attack Muslim people and attack people of any other background other than being a white Christian like herself. And then the Liberals who aren't willing to really stand up to that fear-mongering and the racism of One Nation. They are still not willing to say that, no, they will have absolutely nothing to do with them. Pauline Hanson, I was there in the Parliament when she sort of walked into the Parliament wearing the burqa, and just to ridicule Muslim people. And that's what's going on in our Parliament. I mean, Peter Dutton, we have Peter Dutton in the whole Liberal playbook over the last month of saying, the Greens are just as extreme as Fraser Anning and Pauline Hanson. It was just absolutely appalling. He's the one that said it was a mistake to let in Muslim Lebanese migrants in the 1970s. And he's the one who urged the Cabinet to make it harder for anyone fleeing war in Syria to have permanent residency in Australia. Basically, these politicians are using their platform to stoke fear, to stoke hatred, anti-Semitism, racism and bigotry. And that's, and we've got worldwide the rise of white supremacism and neo-Nazis, and it's taking hold in Australia. So then the question is then, what can we do about it? What must we insist of our politicians to do about it? So, certainly as Greens, absolutely proud to be part of a party that has always called out racism, that, we walked out on Pauline Hanson's first speech and did not attend Fraser Anning's first speech. And we have been working really hard over the last couple of years to be developing a plan, basically, because what we want to see is a united, respectful society, decent society that really welcomes and celebrates difference and acknowledges that we're all part of a common humanity and that we're all equal. So some of the things that we've been doing, Richard Di Natale has been working very closely with the Muslim community. We've set up a sort of Greens Muslim group that work regularly together. He met with the Grand Mufti and the President of the Australian National Imams Council in Sydney recently to be working out how we could be working together, particularly in the lead up to the election. In my office in this election, we've got a great team of multicultural outreach people who are going to be particularly sort of working into the Muslim community, basically saying that there is support and that in this election they had the opportunity to use their vote reaching out and sort of recognising that there are strong political options and that we in Australia, we can still make our democracy work for us. For all of its faults and all of the horrible people that are currently in our parliaments, we've still pretty much got a system that that if you cast your vote, it's going to be counted for the party of your choice, and it's going to be fair at least at that stage. And we have to actually make that our parliamentary system and our democracy work for us, and let people know that if they see issues that they want to tackle in our society, that by voting that they can do something about it, that it is powerful. Last year I organised a fellowship for multicultural young people to engage people in politics and in political life. In fact, not just young people. In fact, Mohmad was part of that fellowship, and which has been really successful at actually bringing people that previously hadn't been connected into politics and taking action to be involved. And similarly, I've got a fabulous team of volunteers working out of my office at the moment, and sort of Sammy at the back there being one of them. And really increasingly engaging with the Muslim community during Ramadan and hosting iftar dinners. And I've got a women's iftar that I'm going to be organising at this during this Ramadan as well. So these are some of the sort of outreach and the support for the Muslim community that we're doing as Greens. But we know that, you know, it's not enough. That's what we can do and our commitment as Greens to do. So what do we need to be doing? What do we need to make sure happens sort of, you know, across the Parliament? I mean, essentially, first of all, we've got to set in place some standards so that politicians cannot use the platform of Parliament to be speaking hatred. So we're absolutely 100% with the Islamic Council and their campaign to get a federal parliamentary code of conduct. And in fact, we have been working on that for the last couple of years. And in fact, having that code of conduct, we've tried to put up legislation that hasn't gone anywhere because it hasn't had the support from the Labor Party or other parties. The last time we tried that, it was sent off to a parliamentary committee to look at, and they have just decided, no, we don't want a code of conduct. And that's basically both Labor and Liberal have said, no, we don't want a parliamentary code of conduct because they don't want to be held for it. I mean, for over 40 years, politicians have been squabbling between themselves about how to enforce better behaviour. And so having a code of conduct that all MPs have to sign up to is one fundamental and basic way forward. Surely we can achieve that. We need our parliaments to be leading a national strategy to counter violent extremism. So we really need to seriously say what needs to happen, and let's properly resource that and say this is a priority for Australia. Otherwise, Australia that I think of my Australia as being a place that welcomes people, you know, a peaceful, multicultural country that welcomes people from all over the world, that's changing. And so we really need to acknowledge that and say, no, we need a national strategy to do things about that. We have to make hate speech illegal. We've got to change our laws so the sort of hate speech that was surrounded, that fuelled the Christchurch terrorist isn't permitted. So we need to make that hate speech illegal and also to change the law so that to be protecting religious people from discrimination. And rather than having a religious freedom bill, which is potentially being proposed, what we think we need to have is a Charter of Rights. Now, Australia is the only Western democracy that doesn't have a Charter of Rights, and basically if we had a Charter of Rights, it would included in that sort of protect people because of their religious belief. We really need a strong national anti-racism campaign developed by the Human Rights Commission. And I've talked to the Human Rights Commission on a number of occasions about what they're doing there. Incredibly underfunded for the work they're doing there. I mean, they're doing a little bit, but basically it's not seen as a priority by government. They're not funded properly to be rolling it out. So, and the Greens certainly we've got that as part of our platform of what we want to see changed. And we have been pushing for a federal multicultural act to protect and value multiculturalism and actually acknowledge that, yes, this is who Australia is. We are no longer a society that has got, people of British stock sort of at the top of the tree and will just sort of tolerate people from, the rest of the world. No, we are a country that celebrates our diversity and that we know that we are stronger because of our diversity. We, as part of that, would make every government department sort of show what they're doing to foster and support multiculturalism and work to improve diversity sort of right across the community, including on boards, in our media and our sporting institutions. So in order to do that, we want to work with everybody. And I think it's really critical to be really getting all sectors of society who share these positions to be working effectively together. And particularly, it's really terrific to have Luke here and sort of have the involvement of the union movement, because I think it's a powerful force for change. It's going to be I think we've got the beginnings of a really powerful, community union, political parties sort of coalescing together to create change. And we really need to do it. I mean, otherwise the divisions in our society are just going to deepen. So now is the time for unity to be working together. Now's the time for decency and for a renewed recognition of our common humanity. So, we really must come together to support each other and to stand together against racism, against hatred and bigotry, and reflect as a nation how we've got here and how we are going to choose to move on together as one. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Luke Hilikari. Luke is the Secretary of the Trades Hall Council of Victoria. He's worked alongside some of the lowest paid workers, effectively fighting for their rights and for wage justice. We also have to remember he's part of an amazing movement, and this is a movement that has a proud history in fighting for the rights of workers, but it also has played an instrumental role in Australia's history. And it's a massive, if you actually go and read the actions that the union movement have been involved in as a force for social change, it's incredible, okay? And without the trade union movement, we wouldn't have had some of the major social changes that we've actually achieved in Australia. And I think this is something that we have to recognise. It is a movement that, once it gets behind a cause, has an incredible power to reach to so many people. And so I think this is a really great opportunity, and I think it's something that Luke may be able to even talk about it, and talk about how we can actually all work together. Thanks, Luke.
Comrades, brothers and sisters, thank you for having me here today. Thank you to the organisers. We think this is a really important forum, because now is not the time for thoughts and prayers. Now is the time for all of us to come together to defend our values. That's what we believe. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, pay our deep respects to elders past, present, emerging. This land was stolen, never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, some of the other speakers rightly have identified that there is a context to this conversation, and that's 250 years of structural racism and colonialism. And we should situate this discussion right in the middle of that debate. And so on one level, we should not be surprised that the person who committed this atrocious crime was an Australian, right? Like, the structures have been set up, have been developed for this to take place. For the mighty Victorian union movement, we are comprised of workers from all walks of life, and you would have seen us, 150,000, we said 200,000 of us, on the streets of Melbourne, and all races, all classes, all religions, all abilities. We're on the streets together. We believe that racism, like bigotry and sexism, is a workplace issue that we are committed to fighting, and it's entrenched in our economic system that makes racism and these attitudes devalue the work and contribution of migrants and migrant workers and people of colour. We've seen some of the most extreme cases of this take place in recent times, and I don't want to touch on that. But before we get there, the union movement needs to acknowledge our own terrible history in this space. When the Victorian Trades Hall Council was founded, one of the first motions that we passed was to discriminate against Chinese workers on the goldfields. We were doing some history digging in Trove the other day, and we discovered a group of Chinese workers who were carpenters. They formed their own Chinese Workers' Union. They applied to be a member of the Trades Hall Council. What did we do? We rejected them. It gets worse though, right? So that was bad that we rejected a group of people who wanted to come together to improve their working lives. When they came together sort of in the late 1800s, there was a series of industrial strikes, and one of them was on the docks. And what this group of Chinese workers did is they raised a bunch of money to contribute to these striking workers. They brought it forward and they brought it to the Trades Hall Council, and we gratefully accepted it, and then we returned it. Because we didn't think it was right to take money from Chinese people. So we as a movement should acknowledge our history, because it acknowledges our mistakes, but it helps us set us in a better direction about what comes next. Basically, no one knows that story, right? We only recently found it. It's a terrible, terrible story. So we need to be deliberate and purposeful in how we address racism in our community and in our workplaces. That's why last year we set up the Migrant Workers Centre. Now, I think in the 80s we also had a Migrant Workers Centre, but guess who was employed in that Migrant Workers Centre? Anybody? Come on. White people. What type of white people?
Men.
Male white people, right? So this centre that we set up now is a Migrant Workers Centre run by migrants, run by people of colour, to organise in their communities. And some of the stuff we've found is abhorrent already. There's a case of Kasun and Sandy, some of you might have seen in the media. This was a couple that fled Sri Lanka due to the violence there. They saw, well, you can imagine, but they saw some horrific things. They then came to Melbourne, they were looking for a job, they worked in an accommodation place, a very well-known accommodation place in the city as caretakers. At the end of their first year working in that accommodation facility as caretakers, collectively between them, they earned $106 by the time the boss took off their rent. After 6 years of work, they were owed $700,000 in wages. Now, they didn't feel at the time they could speak up. Well, partly because they were worried about their visa, so there's a power dynamic there. Partly they were worried about, well, where else am I going to live? Where else am I going to find a job? But the boss knew that they could exploit those people. Same what's happening every day up and down, Elizabeth Street, or if you go up in Chinatown, people working there as little as $10 an hour. We represented some people, actually we had a protest in Box Hill last Friday at Mongo Dessert. Again, people there were being paid $10 an hour. After a year of doing that, we have two people who are owed $20,000 each. We're finding this all the time. So this is our job, to try to seek wage justice, but we want to be more than just that, right? We've got to be more than that. And these stories you've heard in the media, like consistently, be it 7-Eleven, Caltex, Muffin Break, where we find exploitation and where people of colour are working in that space, they're being more exploited than any other group of workers. So we think a lot needs to be done. When we reflect on what's happening on Christchurch, the rise of racism, white supremacists, right-wing extremists has happened in complete public view. It's not like we think that people have been born to be a racist. They learnt this, right? And I don't think it's because they're seeking out, the dark corners of the web with 4chan or 8chan or anything like that. Like they're seeing it on, common platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, and then they turn on their TV and they see it on Sunrise, and they see it on Sky News. They look at our parliament and they see it all throughout the parliament, like the other speakers have spoken about. You have Peter Dutton coming to town around Christmas, January last year, where he said that we are scared as Melburnians to go out to restaurants because of Sudanese gangs. We know what he's saying when he says that. We remember government senators voted a motion to say it's okay to be white, like white people in this nation are the victims. We've seen Pauline Hanson, we spoke just recently about her stunt when she put on a burqa, walked into the Senate to ridicule people of the Islamic faith. Fraser Anning was elected on 14 votes, and we saw his response to the Christchurch massacres. We see what Kochi has done on Channel 7. He paid Pauline Hanson to be on that show and chose to sat next to him to give her a platform to get re-elected. But this parliament feels to me more racist than it has been in a long time. Senator Rice was right. For many, many years, the major parties and the minor parties had a common view on multiculturalism and migration. It was very hard to find a difference, really. If you look at the influx, of the great influx of Vietnamese people, that was a Liberal Prime Minister who pushed for that. That was Fraser. We have had a radical change. And we are very disturbed that all these views have been legitimised through our parliament and our national discourse. And as a movement, as a union movement, we will not stand for it. The Mighty Union Movement is comprised of a diverse group of workers, and our most growing group of workers are people from migrant backgrounds, and a large number of them hold an Islamic faith. So we stand with them. We will welcome everyone in our movement except Nazis. Nazis can just fuck off, right? They can go back and hiding in their suburban gyms for all I care. That's where they belong, pumping weights. Trades Hall has been attacked by Nazis. It's only been right-wing extremists who threatened to, well, it was currently someone before the courts who threatened to bomb the place. They are a threat to our democracy. And the fact that security agencies have been targeting the left rather than looking at the real threat, which is angry men who are, homophobic, Islamophobic, racist, bigotry, sexist, You know, that's where their target actually could have been, because they're the people who are doing real damage in our communities. And because I think as a community we can see what these politicians are doing. They're saying, focus on the other, at the same time as they exploit working people. At the same time they run down our hospitals and run down our schools. They're using that as a distraction to get their own economic way. And we as a community of unionists have had enough. We are not stupid, we are seeing what they're doing, and we are out up for the fight to work with all these fine people right here at the stage and all of you to make sure that we end Islamophobia and racism in this country. Thank you for having me.
And I think, you know, I don't know if anyone's aware of, back in the, I think in the 50s or 60s, I can't remember when it was, you know, the Australian Union movement actually got behind the anti-apartheid movement and was actually one of the biggest forces in this country of moving the discourse in this country in relation to the anti-apartheid movement. So you do have form.
We had bad form, but then we got better. We're still working on that form.
You do have
form later. We're trying, all right?
Like Australian society as a whole.
Yeah. Reflection.
Yeah, but I mean that in itself shows what how effective the union movement was actually in changing the language around apartheid in South Africa. So I think that's something that we also need to recognise, and that we have to give kudos to the union movement for doing that great work. So on that note, I'm going to now introduce you to our last speaker. Our last speaker is Anu Kalot, and she's coming live to us across from New Zealand. She works in a sister organisation very similar to what we have here in Victoria called the Migrant Worker Centre. She works for the Migrant Workers Association in New Zealand and doing a very similar work to what the Migrant Worker Centre does, and that is working predominantly with international students and migrant workers to empower them in their workplaces and so that they can ensure that their work rights are being enshrined. Because we know some of the most vulnerable workers in our workplaces in Australia are migrant workers, okay? And they could either be international students, they might be workers on a visa, or they might be new migrants. So I think when we think about that as well, there's a large amount of racism and discrimination that's actually built into the wage theft and exploitation. Hi, Anu, can you hear me?
Yeah, I could hear you when you were tapping the mic.
Okay.
You can hear that?
You might have to speak into it.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Very faintly, but I can hear you just about.
Yeah. Welcome, Anu. We've got a room full of people looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so I've already just introduced you. Why don't you start talking a little bit about your involvement and the work that you do in New Zealand? Oh, can you?
I can barely hear you, so I'm thinking maybe to save time if I just start speaking.
Yes, please do. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much
Oh,
better. Yay! Yeah, much better. So what I want to touch on is that when people say that they were shocked by the Christchurch mosque attack, it was just out of the blue. It couldn't have happened in New Zealand, but it shouldn't be a surprise. When we've got that kind of history of racism, and then there's also like soft racism that we see on a day-to-day basis that kind of has been going unchallenged up until recently. So it's not a surprise that those attacks happened. And just to look at a few things that were happening, say about a year ago, 2 years ago, when actually we launched Love Aotearoa Hate Racism about a year ago, two speakers came here from Canada, two far-right speakers, Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux. They'd done their tour in Australia and then they arrived here. Looking at the sort of hatred they spread, they are transphobes, they are Islamophobes, they are anti-migrant, they are anti-women, I mean, for Lauren Southern to say that women can't ever be in sort of positions of power or in leadership roles because, you know, they don't have the mindset or the psychology to cope with those kinds of jobs. It's obvious, you know, these people are spreading their hatred and they're from another planet, I would say. So those types of events were real indicators that this is not just speakers arriving here to spread their hatred. This is an effort to launch a far-right political party or a far-right movement here in New Zealand that would so also to add to the equation, there's a Hobson's Pledge, a movement that's been around for a little while now, and that's headed by a person called Don Brash. Don Brash has been in the past leader of the National Party, the political party who was in power here for the last 9 years or so, and then he went on to form another political party, the ACT Party. So Hobson's Pledge, Hobson being the Captain William Hobson, who was the first British Governor General here, and who was also the co-author of the Treaty of Waitangi. So you know, this group is clearly far right and clearly anti-migrant, anti-Maori, anti anyone who is on the left, anti-unionists, anti-Marxist. So this group has been around for about 3-4 years, and there's a lot of other fringe groups who sort of encircle Hobson's Pledge, and you know that they've been protesting openly against Muslims. They've been protesting against the UN's Migration Compact, and that was put out only a few months ago, and New Zealand, the government was due to sign that compact. And you know, so looking at some of their placards and banners they carry, like, you know, no to Sharia law, as if, you know, we've ever had Sharia law in countries like New Zealand or Australia. So you know, these are the kinds of things that have been happening, and they have sort of created the atmosphere that led up to 15th of March and the Christchurch mosque attacks. So we launched Love Aotearoa Hate Racism specifically in response to when those two right-wing Canadian speakers were coming here. And I think New Zealand, if I'm not wrong, New Zealand's been the only country where they had to leave without actually speaking. So, you know, the opposition was so great, you know, they were protested against so hardly and passionately that the venue that they had booked for their speaking event, at the last minute, the owners of that venue did the right thing and shut them down. They refused to host them, so that was actually quite helpful in shutting them down, and that they had to flee without speaking. And since we, soon after that, it was announced that Pauline Hanson from Australia would come and speak here. And again, you know, groups like ourselves and a few other groups, we started opposing, and she didn't even turn up. The protest was very cancelled. We had another person, what's his name? Jordan Peterson, who's another transphobe and Islamophobe and anti-migrant. I think he came over, and we've also had Nigel Farage from the UK's former UKIP leader. But they've had very, very small audiences, and you know, both events have been opposed and protested against. So I also want to talk about, you know, what kinds of groups we have in Love Aotearoa Hate Racism, because to oppose the far right and to oppose the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis and fascists, we need a lot of groups to come together and form really strong united fronts. So within Love Aotearoa Hate Racism, we have various groups. We have unionists, trade unionists, we have socialist groups, we have migrant community groups, we have migrant workers associations, we have Maori activists, and we have Muslim organizations, we have Christian organizations, we have groups from Sikh religion, so a wide variety of groups coming together to fight this evil of racism and the neo-Nazis. In the past year or so, we've done, every time these neo-Nazis and the far-right groups are out protesting, we've always gone out and countered their protests. And the one thing to note is that these other groups, they're always very small in numbers. I think they would range, around 20, 30 people. The biggest ones we've seen around 100. So we've always been able to outnumber them. So that's a great thing, that they're very weak. So I doubt if they will ever grow in numbers as such. Whereas the Aotearoa hate racism movement has grown at a very rapid rate, which is gives us hope and confidence that together we'll be able to fight this evil. After the 15th of March attacks, it was, I think for a lot of people here in New Zealand, it was a bit of a wake-up call. Although we had been trying to make people aware in the past year or so, like, come on, we've got to unite and fight this. If we don't, these people are really emboldened, because if we look globally, the rise of Trump, and then, various other far-right parties coming into power, political parties coming into power in Europe, and then we see Bolsonaro in Brazil, and my home country, India, the governing party there since 2014 is a very far-right nationalist Hindu fascist party. So all of that put together, these people are quite emboldened and empowered to act. So we've been trying to highlight that over the past year, that we need to keep fighting to stop something really tragic happening. So on that level, when 15th of March attack happened, I think we as a group felt that we had failed. That was exactly what we were trying to avoid. But obviously, looking at the sort of solidarity that the whole of New Zealand has shown with the Muslim community, with the migrants, and also at an international level, that the solidarity has been outstanding. It gives us hope and confidence that more and more people are joining this movement against racism. So in the coming weeks and months, we'll be able to gather much more support and actually fight and just outnumber these people. And to give you an example from the UK, back in the 80s and the 90s, the Anti-Nazi League there, that's exactly what they did. I think that they outnumbered these idiots and just drove them off the streets. So that's quite a good strategic way of fighting them. So just a little bit more about things that have been happening since the attacks. So as you will see, as you'll know, that there have been an endless number of vigils all over the country and internationally as well. So while that was needed at that time, people need to grieve and people need to heal. I'm not sure if you can ever heal from such an attack, especially people who have lost family and friends. But vigils have been, a lot of vigils. But being a migrant myself, being a person of colour myself, I was interacting with a lot of migrants, within days after the attack, and I could sense this anger inside, this frustration and anger inside migrants. So we felt that vigils were not enough. So people came a time when people were vigiled out, and they needed to channel that anger to something more meaningful and positive. So that's what we did on the 24th of March. We also had Jasmine and Ian Rintle with us. We held this peaceful march through the city of Auckland, and we had about 5,000 people, which is I think the largest march we've ever organised. So since then, we've had more and more people join us. So in the coming days, we will form a proper steering committee so that we can organise further events, range of events where we can educate everybody about what migrants, how migrants live and how they contribute, and also how we can fight the neo-Nazis and fascists, and hold conferences, workshops, multicultural musical events, and those kinds of things. And also, there's some talks of forming groups who can lobby the government. I think there's some talk about passing some laws against hate speech. So that's all under discussion, and lots of things like that. I think that's about it. And
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anu. Thank you so much. I think what you've brought up there about the need to build those broad coalitions is very important. And also something I was thinking about when we were talking about is really the whole social media is where these horrible right-wingers and alt-right people get their oxygen. And deplatforming the members of the alt-right is actually things that we can do, and we can see the results of deplatforming. Obviously, Yiannopoulos was taken off Twitter and hasn't been able to access Twitter in a while now, and that's actually, if you can see, the oxygen has been taken out of him. Abiy Emini has just recently been booted off Facebook. I don't know if anyone knows about that.
He was deported from the USA.
So we can see that's actually a very important tool as well for actually getting far-right, these horrible far-right nationalist neo-Nazis to actually lose their status and positions within those fringe communities, is actively deplatforming them on social media.
People speak.
I actually wasn't going to ask this question, but when Anu mentioned the solidarity that was experienced after Christchurch with the Muslim community, and locally, I personally saw a lot of outpouring of grief and also engagement with the Muslim community. People actually met an imam. They actually spoke to a lady with a hijab on, There was this engagement, and sadly, it needed Christchurch for that to happen. But then I took note that you actually said that it seems to have not stuck with us. There's been an issue, there's been some bad things happened since. Like, in other words, it wasn't enough. And sadly, we needed Christchurch to even make us think about it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's something actually I missed to probably mention. I think that that man of solidarity with the Muslim community after what happened in Christchurch has been something that I have never seen anything like it. And I can also say that it has made a real difference to the lives of Muslims in Australia. There is no doubt about that. It has made a difference. And that support has come from almost all walks of life, from the political side, particularly the Greens and the Labour Party, has come from the union movement, and has come from all faiths as well. An epic of that was the vigil that was organised by the Islamic Council of Victoria in the city, in front of the library. That was one of the most emotional events that I've attended. So certainly, I think the wider community Christchurch has actually brought the community together. There were tons of flowers outside most mosques, even here in Melbourne. One of the most memorable things that I saw outside a mosque was, with the flowers, there was a pack of eggs, in reference to the egg boy, so I think that was absolutely. But at the same time, I think that people on the far right extreme were emboldened by comments, particularly from people like from Fraser Anning. They have been emboldened, and there has been a spike in incidents. But I think definitely overridden by the amount of support from the wider community. Yeah.
I tried to, I asked some of my friends, members of the Uyghur community in Australia, to come here tonight so they could share their stories. of their experiences of Islamophobia in a context maybe that's a little bit different to the one we've been talking about tonight. But this is something that has been, in and around media for a couple of years, but still has a very low level of it. People do not know much about this, and I was just wondering if you would be able to speak to that a little bit and just educate some of us here about what's happening to the Uyghur community in Xinjiang or East Turkestan. They would like to talk it, like to refer.
Yeah, and on that there was actually a rally just last week organised with the Islamic Council of Victoria and the Uyghur community, and actually Senator Janet Rice spoke at that same event as well. To be perfectly honest, generally the awareness in Australia about that issue and what's happening there is definitely is very low profile. I should also say, even amongst the Muslim communities, even the Islamic Council of Victoria, even myself, I myself am educating myself about the issue. And we're slowly coming to terms about the size and the atrocities happening in that particular sector. It was interesting that a couple of weeks ago, there was a program on the Radio National that I was listening to over the radio, and they were talking about ethics associated with DNA testing. And the lady who was speaking mentioned as an example specifically in terms of abuse, state abuse of DNA testing, that she said that the Chinese government is forcing people in the Uyghur community to do compulsory DNA testing for a reason unknown to the speaker on the program. We've all heard about the camps that are happening, the separation of children from their parents, and essentially brainwashing activities by the Chinese government against that sector, against that group of Chinese Muslims. We are, as I say, we're just really trying to, we've certainly actually spoken, the Islamic Council of Victoria has specifically spoken about to Richard Dinitali actually on the advisory panel about that same specific issue. But apart from that, really, there is not much more I can say because I myself am learning about the topic. So yeah, so that's it, I think.
To start with a comment, I remember in the 1990s when Pauline Hanson was trying to create a mass racist party, and there was a successful movement to shut down her meetings. At that time she was demonising Aboriginal people and Asians, and since then she jumped on the Islamophobic bandwagon, but she didn't create that. It's had much more of an expression at the centre of Australian politics, and it hasn't just been the words like, Peter Dutton smearing Lebanese people as terrorists, or Scott Morrison trying to beat up the Shire Ali thing into a terrorist incident when it wasn't. It is part of government policy. So you've seen wave after wave of national security legislation, the anti-terror laws, revoking of citizenship. I mean, John Howard changed a simple word from "that" to in the terror laws, which allowed, instead of it being the terrorist organisation, the terrorist act, it could allow ASIO to define any young group of people talking to each other or mouthing off as a terrorist group, as having a terrorist plot that allows all those raids. So I think opposing the terror laws is one thing that is important. And the other thing in the policy is that the Syrian refugee intake, you had Christians explicitly prioritised. In terms of what we can do about it, I was quite heartened by the statement from the head of the trade unions in New Zealand that came out in the wake of it. And I want to say a lot more, but I'll keep it short. One of the things we put that up on our union notice board at work, and in my union, the education union, we passed a motion at our council just to create some workplace posters, solidarity with Christchurch victims, no to racism, no to Islamophobia. And I wonder if that's the sort of thing that we could do across the union movement more widely, to take this as an opportunity to push back. It's not going to stop Islamophobia, but to push some of that stuff back. I mean, if you could label Morrison and the people at the heart of it, that wouldn't hurt either.
Yeah, so quite a bit in that. The way I sort of think about it is this is an issue in my mind that goes back to Tampa almost. I've heard from a lot of progressives that they think that too. The Labor Party made a terrible decision right back then, and then have been making a series of other terrible decisions because they think they don't have enough faith in Australian people. They just don't. At that time, they didn't think we were big-hearted enough to accept people coming from foreign shores who are fleeing terror and violence. The fact that had been allowed to creep in for the next 20 years into our culture has done significant damage. Kim Beazley made a terrible, terrible decision there, and he lost the election, in my view, at that moment too. In terms of what the union movement can do, well, we can do a lot. I think we've recently been partnering up with you guys, Unionists for Refugees, T-shirts, banners, all that type of stuff. But it is a moment in time for us to educate our membership. For some time now, the Trades Hall Council has had very strong views on racism and Islamophobia, along with another bunch of isms that we've been trying to deal with. This is a moment also for us to make better connections. Mohmad and I have to work harder together, and we have to do the effort, really. Like that's our burden to educate our membership. So it's a lot, right? Some unions are in different places as well on this. We're a broad church. We have 40 different unions that are affiliated to the hall. Some people are quite good on their outreach and education with their members, and others need help, and some don't think it's a priority. It's a journey, but we're on it and we're committed, and we don't want racism in this country because we know it hurts everybody and our members.
So we're going to wrap up now, and I just want to say a few thank yous before we finish off. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming, because that was it's been amazing. I think there's a groundswell of support, and I think everything starts small, but we can actually make this grow into something much bigger, and we all can play a role in it. We all can play active roles in it. I would like to now thank all the speakers. It's been an amazing a feat, especially of Jasmine bringing all of you into this room and then having you here too. I think it's great, and I think all of you have an opportunity to work together and to move this forward as well. And we're happy to jump on board as Stand Together Against Racism to support you. We are activists, we are grassroots activists, and are really happy to go onto the ground and roll out things that you have some strategic vision for. So that's something that you can also count on us and our support. Is that right, Jasmine? Yeah. Yes. I'd like to also thank the ANMF, all our committee members for giving us access to this space. I'd like to thank Senator Janet Rice, Senator Richard DiNatale and Adam Band for donating money so that we could have that amazing food. Please go and eat it. Thank you. And yes, it was amazing. Thank you so much. And ASRC Catering. Yes, thank you very much. And also to all the activists in Stand Together Against Racism. Many of you are in the background there, do so much work behind the scenes. And, that's because you all care about this issue. And I think I say thank you. Solidarity.